What if the bomb that just changed an entire war was not the biggest one in the arsenal, but the smartest? Look closely at that hillside on the coast of Hormuzgan province. You're not watching the moment of impact. You are watching the earth vomit fire about a second and a half after the weapon already hit. Everything tearing upward is the aftermath. The missiles, the launchers. The crates of ordnance Iran spent years burying under rock and hardened concrete because someone in Tehran decided that depth meant safety. It did not. It only meant the blast had further to travel before it broke the surface. For 13 straight nights, this kind of footage played on repeat. Coastal bunkers, drone storage tunnels, IRGC naval assets, all of it getting worked over in what became one of the most sustained air campaigns the region has ever seen. Then, just days ago, it stopped. Not because anything broke down militarily. It stopped because a diplomatic channel reopened, and the people running this war decided it was worth pausing to see if Iran actually wanted to talk. Or if this was just another stall tactic while they waited for the world to lose interest. If you are tired of headlines that skip the actual mechanics, take 10 seconds right now, hit like on this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this breakdown with someone who actually wants to understand the weapons, the logistics, and the real stakes instead of just scrolling past noise. We cover this closely, and you do not want to miss the next update. Now, we need to ask whether that pause holds. But first, let us talk about the weapon that made the last 2 weeks look completely different from everything that came before it. Because there is a new bomb in the rotation. And it is the reason those underground bunkers stopped being a safe place to hide anything. Before this new bunker buster entered the picture, Iran's whole strategy made a certain kind of sense. Bury it deep enough, harden the concrete enough. Even a direct hit from a 2,000-pound JDAM might just chip the surface and leave the actual stockpile intact underneath. That calculation worked for years. It stopped working the moment American aircraft started dropping a 5,000-pound precision penetrator, built specifically to solve that exact problem. Over the last several weeks, it has been used against hardened storage sites up and down the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz, chewing through bunkers that were built to survive exactly this kind of war, and mostly did not. So stick with me, because we are going to break down exactly what this bomb is, how it compares to the bigger bunker busters everyone has already heard about, which aircraft are actually cleared to carry it, and what 13 nights of this campaign actually accomplished on the ground. We will also walk through how a strike package like this gets built from the ground up, because the bomb itself is only the final step in a much longer chain of aircraft, jamming, and coordination that has to work perfectly for any of this to happen, without losing a single airframe. We are also going to get into what is happening with the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, because that part of the story matters just as much as the bombs falling from the sky. And toward the end, we will take a lap around some other developments worth knowing about, because there is a lot moving right now well outside of Iran too. Let us start with the bomb itself, because this is genuinely one of the more interesting developments of the entire campaign. It is called the GBU-72, also known as the Advanced 5K Penetrator. Until this year, it had never actually been used in combat. It was tested all the way back in 2021, dropped successfully from an F-15E Strike Eagle during trials at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, and then it sat in the American arsenal for years as a kind of insurance policy. A weapon built for exactly this situation, but never actually fired at anyone. That changed when American forces used it for the first time against hardened Iranian positions, holding anti-ship missile systems along the coast. And since then, it has become one of the signature weapons of this entire operation. Here is why it matters so much. For years, the American bunker-busting arsenal basically had two options. On one end, you had the GBU-28, an older 2,000-pound class weapon that could punch through maybe 20 feet of reinforced concrete or around 100 feet of packed earth. Useful, but limited against the kind of deeply buried facilities that a country like Iran has spent decades constructing. On the other end of the spectrum, you had the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, a genuine monster of a weapon weighing in at roughly 30,000 pounds that can chew through more than 200 feet of reinforced concrete or upwards of 260 feet of solid rock. That is the weapon that was used against the Fordo nuclear facility. A target buried so deep in a mountainside that basically nothing smaller could have touched it. But the GBU-57 only fits on one aircraft in the entire world, the B-2 Spirit, and America only has 19 of those in the fleet. You cannot run a nightly campaign of hundreds of targets a night using a bomber that rare. That is the gap the GBU-72 was built to fill. It sits right in the middle. A 5,000-pound weapon that combines a hardened penetrating warhead with a modified JDAM tail kit for GPS and inertial guidance, giving it the accuracy to drop right on top of a target, and the mass to actually punch through into whatever is buried underneath before detonating. It is not designed to go after a mountain fortress like Fordo. It is designed for exactly what we have been watching over the last 2 weeks. mid-tier hardened bunkers, coastal missile storage, underground drone hangars. The kind of target Iran has built hundreds of across the country to protect its ballistic missile and anti-ship arsenal. And critically, it is cleared for aircraft that can actually fly repeat missions night after night, which is the entire difference between a symbolic one-time strike and a sustained campaign that actually degrades a military's capability over time. Only 2 aircraft in the American inventory are currently cleared to carry it. The F-15E Strike Eagle, which is where it was originally tested, and the B-1B Lancer, which is where things get really interesting. The B-1 was designed back in the 70s and 80s as a supersonic, low-altitude nuclear penetrator meant to slip under Soviet radar coverage during the Cold War. That mission disappeared decades ago along with the Soviet Union. But what was left behind is arguably the single most useful conventional bomber in the entire Air Force inventory today. Each B-1 can carry up to 75,000 pounds of precision munitions, more than any other bomber America flies. And unlike the 19 B-2s in the fleet, there are 45 B-1s available to actually generate sorties night after night. When you're running a campaign that hit more than 300 targets in the first 3 nights alone, and roughly 140 targets in a single evening at points, you need an airframe that can fly that pace. The B-1 can. The B-2 simply cannot sustain that tempo. That distinction is not about prestige, it is about mathematics. If you're following this breakdown closely, take a quick second to subscribe and turn on notifications. We are not just covering explosions. We are tracking the aircraft, the logistics, the diplomatic shifts, and the hidden connections between conflicts that most coverage ignores entirely. You want to be here when the next development breaks. There's also a smaller, more common cousin doing a lot of the heavy lifting alongside the new Penetrator. The GBU-31 Viper Strike, a 2,000-pound JDAM built around an older penetrating warhead, has been used extensively throughout this campaign against ballistic missile production facilities, underground command centers, and mobile launcher sites. Think of it as the workhorse next to the specialist. You do not need a 5,000-pound weapon for every target. And when the objective is volume, being able to load up on the smaller, cheaper option and still get the job done against most targets matters just as much as having the heavier option available for the targets that actually need it. None of this happens, by the way, without the boring but absolutely essential logistics behind it. And it is worth taking a second to actually appreciate that, because nobody claps for logistics, but everybody depends on it. Getting bomber squadrons, fighter escorts, electronic warfare aircraft, refueling tankers, ground crews, and munitions into position halfway around the world is not a phone call. It is weeks of coordinated movement. In the opening phase of this operation, several B-1s reportedly flew missions all the way from Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, across the Atlantic, across the Mediterranean to the target area, and back home again, refueling multiple times along the way because forward basing had not been fully cleared yet. That is an extraordinary distance to fly a combat mission and still make it home. Once forward bases in the region opened up for use, the tempo picked up dramatically, because you do not need transatlantic refueling chains when your bombers are launching from somewhere much closer to the fight. Getting into that airspace safely in the first place is its own operation entirely. Before a single bomb from a B-1 or an F-15E can be dropped on a hardened target, someone has to clear a path through Iran's air defense network. And that job falls to a mix of stealth fighters and dedicated electronic warfare aircraft working together to blind and confuse the radar systems that would otherwise be tracking every inbound aircraft. F-22s and F-35s provide the stealth and the situational awareness, slipping through contested airspace largely undetected, while dedicated jamming aircraft flood the electromagnetic spectrum with enough noise to make it extremely difficult for Iranian operators to get a clean radar picture of what is actually inbound. Only once that picture is degraded does it become survivable to send in a bomber carrying tens of thousands of pounds of ordnance on a straight, predictable flight path toward the target. It is a layered operation, and every layer depends on the one before it working correctly. The electronic warfare piece deserves a little more attention than it usually gets because it is the least visible part of this entire operation, and arguably one of the most important. Growler aircraft, built specifically to jam and deceive enemy radar and communications, fly ahead of and alongside the strike package, essentially blinding Iranian air defense operators at the exact moment it matters most. Combine that with the radar hunting variant of the F-16, the jet whose entire job is to detect the moment an Iranian radar site powers on and fire a missile that homes in on that radar signal before the operator even realizes he has been located. And you start to understand why Iran's air defense network has struggled to get a single clean shot at any of these strike packages over 13 nights. It is not that Iran's air defenses do not exist anymore. It is that the moment they try to actually do their job and illuminate a target, they become the target themselves. That is the entire premise behind a suppression of enemy air defenses campaign, and it is exactly why so much of this operation has been able to run night after night without losing aircraft in the process. Before we move deeper into what actually happened on the ground, I want you to do something quick. Drop a comment below with your honest read. Do you think Iran is genuinely negotiating right now, or is this just buying time? Your answers help shape what we cover next, and I genuinely read through them. Also, if this breakdown is helping you see the full picture, hit that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, and it makes sure you do not miss the next update the second it drops. It is also worth putting this new bunker buster in context against the weapon everyone already knows about, because the comparison tells you a lot about how deliberately layered this entire targeting strategy has been. Back in the middle of last year, American B-2 bombers used the massive ordnance penetrator against Iran's Fordo enrichment facility, a target buried so deep inside a mountain that only the heaviest bunker buster in the American arsenal had any real chance of reaching it. That was a surgical one-time strike against a single strategic target using an extremely limited and extremely expensive delivery platform. What is happening right now with the GBU-72 is a completely different kind of operation. This is not about one deeply buried nuclear facility. This is about hundreds of dispersed mid-level hardened bunkers scattered across the country, holding the actual operational inventory Iran depends on day to day. Its ballistic missiles, its anti-ship cruise missiles, its drone stockpiles. You do not send a 30,000-pound bomb carried by one of 19 stealth bombers after a target like that every single night. You need something that scales, something that can be loaded onto dozens of aircraft and used repeatedly without running out of platforms to carry it. That is precisely the gap the GBU-72 fills, and it is why its introduction into this campaign matters so much more than a single flashy strike would. Now, let us actually talk about what all of this bombing has produced on the ground, because the geography here matters enormously. A huge amount of this campaign has focused on the string of islands and coastal positions that Iran has used for years to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, Bandar Abbas, Keshm Island, Greater Tumb, Jask, Hijab. All of these locations have taken repeated hits, specifically targeting the coastal defense systems and anti-ship cruise missile batteries that give Iran the ability to hold one of the most important shipping choke points on the planet at risk. This is not incidental targeting. Roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves through that strait, and Iran has spent years building the exact capability needed to threaten it whenever it wants leverage, in a negotiation or wants to punish the world economy for sanctions pressure back home. And Iran has not just relied on missiles to make the threat real. Reports over the last few days indicate that Iran has continued seeding naval mines throughout parts of the strait, effectively daring commercial and military vessels to sail through water it no longer fully controls, but still wants to make dangerous. There was a claim just hours before this video that the IRGC struck another tanker transiting the strait, though the ship in question reportedly went off course and struck a mine rather than being hit by a direct missile or drone strike. That distinction matters less to the ship's crew than it does to the propaganda value Iran gets either way. Because whether it is an underwater unmanned vehicle functioning essentially like a small torpedo, a mine sitting in the shipping lane, or a drone skimming low across the surface toward the stern of a tanker, the end result is the same message. Nothing moving through that strait is guaranteed to make it through safely. And Iran wants the world to know that even while its own coastal defenses are getting dismantled night after night, that is exactly why the blockade being enforced against Iran matters just as much as the bombing campaign, maybe more. Even during the pause in strikes, that part of the operation has not slowed down at all. Reports over the last several days indicate more than a dozen vessels tied to Iranian shipping have been redirected, several disabled outright, and at least a couple boarded and inspected by naval personnel before being cleared to continue or turned away. One vessel flying under a foreign flag was reportedly boarded in the Arabian Sea, its cargo inspected before being allowed to proceed. This is the quieter half of the pressure campaign, the part that does not produce dramatic fireball footage, but arguably matters more to a regime that depends heavily on oil revenue to fund everything from its missile program to the security forces keeping its own population in line. Cutting off that revenue barrel by barrel, ship by ship, adds up over weeks in a way that a single night of air strikes never could on its own. So why the pause in actual strikes right now? Officials have been fairly direct about it. The pattern that led here was sanctions pressure crippling the Iranian economy, followed by nearly 2 weeks of nightly strikes dismantling large portions of Iran's military infrastructure. And only after both of those pressure points had been applied did the diplomatic door reopen, with Iran suddenly appearing more willing to engage seriously. That sequencing is deliberate. Nobody negotiates from a position of strength after watching their coastal defenses, ballistic missile storage, and drone facilities get worked over for 13 consecutive nights. Officials have described Iran as increasingly serious in these talks as the days go by, while also making clear that the campaign can resume and potentially resume heavier than before if the diplomatic track does not produce something real. On the Iranian side, a military spokesperson confirmed that Tehran halted its own retaliatory strikes in response to the pause, which tells you Iran wanted the breathing room just as much as anyone, if not more. That said, this is a good moment to be honest about what Iran still has, because pretending the campaign has left them with nothing would be misleading. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, even after 2 weeks of sustained bombing, is still estimated to number in the thousands, and the capability has not been eliminated, only degraded. Iran's forces have continued launching missiles and drones at regional targets throughout this campaign, and while the overwhelming majority get intercepted, a meaningful number still get through, and some of those have resulted in real casualties among American and partner forces stationed in the region. That is not a footnote. Real people have been killed in this conflict on both sides. And it is worth pausing to acknowledge the service members who have paid the ultimate price carrying out these operations, along with their families who are living with that loss right now. This is not a video game with a clean scoreboard. It is a real war with real consequences, even when the footage of exploding bunkers makes it look almost cinematic from a distance. Every strike package we have talked about tonight has real people flying it, real ground crews arming it, and real families back home waiting for a phone call that everyone made it back safely. That context does not show up in the target footage, but it should never get lost underneath it. If this part of the story hits differently for you, do something right now that takes 2 seconds. Hit the like button. It genuinely helps push this kind of coverage to more people who are trying to actually understand what is going on, instead of just scrolling past headlines. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the exact kind of channel that tracks these details closely, so go ahead and do it now. It is also worth being honest about how easy it still is for a determined actor to cause disruption, even inside a badly degraded military. It does not take a functioning air force or a large naval fleet to hijack global attention. It takes a handful of people willing to follow orders, some cheap drone technology, and a target of opportunity, whether that is a commercial vessel transiting a choke point or a piece of infrastructure sitting exposed along a coastline. That asymmetry is exactly why this kind of conflict is so difficult to fully resolve through air power alone. And it is part of why the blockade and the economic pressure track matters just as much as anything falling out of the sky. There is also a question of proxy capability that does not get nearly enough attention in most coverage of this conflict. Iran has spent decades cultivating relationships with a line of militias and armed groups scattered across the region. And even with its own conventional military, taking a beating night after night, those proxy relationships do not disappear overnight. Weapons, funding, and training that flowed outward over the years do not get vaporized along with a bunker on the coast of Hormozgan province. That means even in a scenario where Iran's own missile and drone stockpiles are ground down to a fraction of what they were at the start of this campaign, the broader network of pressure Iran can apply across the region does not necessarily shrink at the same rate. That is exactly the kind of gap that keeps military planners up at night. Degrading a government's ability to fight a conventional war is one thing. Degrading its ability to fund and arm proxies who can cause chaos with a fraction of the cost and none of the accountability is a much harder problem. And it is one that does not get solved with any single bomb, no matter how effective it is against a bunker. Now let us take a lap around some other developments worth knowing about, because there is genuinely a lot moving right now, well outside of the Iran story. Over in Eastern Europe, Romanian airspace has seen a run of intercepts over the last several days that is worth paying attention to. A Romanian F-16 shot down an unidentified drone over Romanian territorial waters, not far from the Black Sea coast, marking the third consecutive day that Romanian fighters have brought down an intruding drone. What makes that notable is that before this stretch, Romania had gone more than 4 years without a single confirmed shootdown, despite sitting right next door to an active war between Russia and Ukraine. One of those earlier intercepts only succeeded after Italian fighters operating in the region engaged first, but failed to bring the target down, with Romanian F-16s finishing the job. Romanian officials have since identified at least one of the downed drones as a Shahed-type munition, the same Iranian-designed drone family that has become one of Russia's signature long-range strike weapons throughout its war against Ukraine. The fact that these drones keep drifting into NATO airspace is its own quiet warning sign about how porous that border has become as the war grinds on. And speaking of the overlap between these two conflicts, there have been increasing reports, including comments from Ukrainian officials, suggesting that Russia has been providing Iran with meaningful targeting assistance, both for its ballistic missile strikes and for broader intelligence support. That should not come as a huge surprise if you think through the incentives involved. Russia benefits enormously from the United States staying distracted and resource committed in the Persian Gulf. Every Patriot interceptor missile burned shooting down an Iranian ballistic missile in the Gulf is one fewer interceptor available to help Ukraine defend against Russian missile strikes. It is a cheap, low-risk way for Moscow to tie up American attention and munition stockpiles without directly escalating its own war with the West. And it lines up neatly with a pattern we have seen throughout this entire conflict of technology and expertise flowing quietly between Moscow and Tehran. There has also been continued movement on the air-to-air side of the Ukraine conflict worth mentioning briefly. Ukrainian pilots flying F-16s have continued to score confirmed kills against Russian fighters. And what makes those engagements notable is not just the outcome, but the way they are happening. Neither side in that particular matchup has a true stealth advantage. So these fights largely come down to who gets eyes on the other aircraft first. Ukraine has increasingly leaned on early warning aircraft and ground-based radar cueing to get its F-16s into position before Russian pilots even know they are being tracked. It is a reminder that a lot of modern air combat is not decided by which jet is objectively more advanced. It is decided by which side sees the other one first and gets a missile off from beyond visual range before the fight ever becomes a dogfight. Zooming out to the bigger picture here, the strategic situation right now genuinely comes down to a fairly simple question. Does Iran actually want a deal, or does it just want time? Everything in the regime's recent behavior points toward trying to manufacture leverage it does not actually have anymore. Getting even a handful of hits on American assets or regional bases, even while its own military infrastructure is being dismantled night after night, gives Iranian leadership something to point to domestically and something to bring to the negotiating table that makes it look like the conflict is not one-sided. But the underlying numbers tell a different story. 13 nights of sustained strikes plus a full economic blockade is not a position of strength, no matter how loud the rhetoric coming out of Tehran gets. And the harder question underneath all of this is whether that pressure eventually produces a real negotiated outcome, or whether it starts to crack the regime's grip domestically in a way that opens space for internal opposition to grow, especially in a country that has spent much of this year also cracking down hard on its own protesters, even while fighting a war on multiple fronts. That contradiction is worth sitting with for a second. This is a government that has continued carrying out executions of its own citizens and suppressing protests even in the middle of an active war that is actively degrading its military capability night after night. That is not the behavior of a government negotiating from a position of confidence. That is the behavior of a government that understands its grip on power depends far more on fear at home than on any credible military deterrent abroad. And it is choosing to spend scarce resources and attention protecting that grip even while its coastal defenses get vaporized one bunker at a time. If you have made it this far into the video, I need you to do 3 things. First, smash that subscribe button if you have not already. We are tracking every development in this conflict, and the next update could drop at any time. Second, share this video with one person who keeps asking you what is actually going on over there, because they probably need the full breakdown, not the 30-second headline version. Third, leave your honest take in the comments below. Do you believe this pause turns into a real deal, or is this just Iran buying time? I rate all of them, so where does this actually go from here? If the diplomatic track produces something real, something Iran actually adheres to instead of using as a reconstitution window like in the past, then you could genuinely be looking at the beginning of an off-ramp for this entire conflict. If it does not, and if Iran uses this pause the way it has used pauses before, quietly rebuilding stockpiles, repositioning mobile launchers, buying time until attention drifts elsewhere, then the campaign almost certainly resumes. And given the trajectory of the last 2 weeks, there is every reason to believe it resumes heavier than before, rather than lighter. New weapons like the GBU-72 do not get introduced into a conflict and then quietly retired. Once a capability proves itself in combat the way this one has over the last several weeks, it becomes a standard part of the toolkit going forward, which means any future round of this campaign starts from a higher baseline of destructive capability than the one that just wrapped up. There's also a longer-term question sitting underneath all of this that is easy to lose track of when you are watching nightly strike footage. And it is the question of what actually happens to a regime that survives a campaign like this, but comes out the other side with its military infrastructure gutted, its economy strangled by a functioning blockade, and its own population increasingly restless after watching their government spend scarce resources on suppression. Regimes do not usually collapse from a single knockout blow. They erode. They lose the ability to project strength abroad. They lose the ability to deliver basic economic stability at home. And eventually, the gap between what the government claims and what people are actually experiencing becomes too wide to paper over. Whether that erosion happens over months or over years is genuinely hard to predict from the outside. But the trajectory right now points in one direction, and it is not toward a stronger, more capable Iranian state. Here is the part that should stay with you long after this video ends. For everyone watching this unfold from thousands of miles away, it is worth remembering that these decisions carry consequences beyond the capitals. Every additional night of strikes affects shipping rates and insurance premiums for tankers moving through the Gulf. Every additional week of blockade tightens oil markets that ripple out into fuel prices everywhere. And every escalation carries the real, uncomfortable possibility of pulling other regional actors deeper into a conflict that started over missiles. It has slowly expanded to touch shipping lanes, allied military bases, and now increasingly the airspace of countries thousands of miles away. Countries that just happen to sit along the flight path of weapons, built by one government and flown by another. That is the part of this story that tends to get lost in the footage of bunkers exploding on a hillside. This is not a contained regional dispute anymore. It is a conflict with tendrils reaching into European airspace and into global oil markets. It reaches into a second separate war that Russia would very much like the world to stop paying attention to. Keeping track of all of those threads at once is exactly why breakdowns like this one matter. Because the headline version of any single night strikes almost never captures how everything connects. If you made it all the way here, you have just done something most people scrolling through news feeds never do. You actually tried to understand the mechanics, the weapons, the logistics, the human cost, the diplomatic tightrope. That is rare, and it matters. So I need you to do 3 final things before you click away. Hit that like button one more time if any part of this actually clicked for you. Drop a quick comment with your take on whether this pause holds or breaks, and subscribe to this channel if you want to keep tracking the story with the kind of depth that actually explains why it matters, instead of just replaying the explosion on loop. This conflict is moving fast. The weapons are getting more precise. The stakes are getting higher. And we will be right here tracking every shift as it develops. Thanks so much for watching. Stay sharp, and we will see you in the next one.